everybody, David Ansardi again, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about body cavities and membranes that line some of your body cavities and cover some of the organs located in those cavities. Okay, so we're going to talk about the body cavities that I'm primarily going to talk about today are major body cavities that are internal to the body and which house major organs and structures. Okay, and these body cavities that we're going to talk about are divided up into first two major body cavities, and one of those is not the doral body cavity that you see here on the slide. That's a typo. That's supposed to be dorsal, like you see written over here on that part of the slide, and the ventral body cavity. Okay, those are your two major internal body cavities. So where's the dorsal body cavity? If you look at this diagram here on the slide, everything you see here shaded in yellow, that is the dorsal body cavity. If you remember on the previous lecture video clip when we talked about dorsal and ventral, dorsal means toward the back, like the dorsal fin is on the back of a shark. Okay, so that's your dorsal body cavity. And then notice here we're looking at this lateral or side view. You should remember also that the diagram that we're looking at there represents a sagittal section, but lateral means side, so sometimes you will see these types of views also labeled as lateral views. Okay, so from a side view here, everything that we see here shaded in red represents the ventral major body cavity, the major body cavity that's located on the front side of the body. Okay, and then over here we're seeing portions of these cavities from an anterior or a coronal, a frontal view of the body. Okay, so let's take a closer look at these major body cavities and how they're divided. Each of those two major body cavities is subdivided into smaller compartments. Okay, so let's do the dorsal body cavity first. Your dorsal body cavity is divided into the cranial cavity that you see here. Okay, and guess what's located in the cranial cavity? That's not too hard to figure out. That contains your brain. And then that space, though, continues all the way down your vertebral column, your spinal column, your backbone, and that portion of the space is referred to as the vertebral cavity. And guess what runs through there? That's where your spinal cord is located. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Okay, now what about your ventral major body cavity? Let's just stay on this slide for a minute. The ventral body cavity can be further subdivided into the thoracic cavity, which contains the heart and the lungs, and then it can also be further divided into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Okay, and then guess what separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity? The diaphragm. And what is the diaphragm? That's a very thin sheet-like muscle which is required for breathing. Okay, and that divides the thoracic from the abdominal and pelvic cavities. These two together are very often referred to as the abdominopelvic cavity. And then yet another term to describe the abdominopelvic cavity is, erase that for a minute, the peritoneal cavity. So as you're going to find out as you progress through your A&P courses, a lot of times there are multiple terms in anatomy that refer to the same things, and that is the case with these cavities. Okay. All right, so the abdominopelvic cavity and the thoracic cavity have some additional divisions. Let's look at the thoracic cavity first. And these further divisions are much easier to see from a coronal or a frontal view, anterior view of the body. Okay, so again, your thoracic cavity includes everything you see here, everything above the diaphragm muscle, which is located there. And notice that this cavity is divided into 4 smaller compartments. Okay, now 2 of those compartments, as you might guess, house the lungs, and those are called your pleural cavities. Okay, and you have a left and a right pleural cavity. This one's going to be the left, because remember, we're thinking about anatomical left and right. And those house the lungs. That's pretty straightforward. Now, within the thoracic cavity, remember, the thoracic cavity includes all of this, the space in between the pleural cavities, right there in the middle, all of that together is referred to as the mediastinum. And where does that word come from? Media should remind you of middle, medial, when we were going over medial and lateral in the last lecture video clip. So this is in the middle of the body, the middle of the thoracic cavity. And then sternum, that actually refers to the sternum. And the sternum is your breastbone, is the common name that you're familiar with for sternum. Okay, so that's where this section of the thoracic cavity gets its name. Okay, and then notice the mediastinum in here can be further divided into 2 compartments. The upper portion up in here is referred to as the superior mediastinum. Superior means toward the top of the body. This is the top portion of the mediastinum, so that's why it's called that. And then below there, guess what major organ is located right in here? I imagine you can figure out that that's where the heart is located. And it is inside the pericardial cavity. Okay, so when you're learning these, don't lose sight of which smaller compartments are located inside bigger compartments. It takes a little bit of work to learn all of these divisions, but it's not hard. Okay, now the abdominopelvic cavity down in here, which contains many of your vital internal organs, like your liver and your spleen and your stomach and your intestines and your bladder and uterus, etc. This can be divided into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. But I don't want you to think that there is something structurally obvious like the diaphragm that's physically separating those 2 compartments. If you've looked at a skeleton before, you've probably noticed that the pelvic bones down in here kind of form a bowl type shape around the pelvis. And so the portions of the abdominopelvic cavity that sit down inside that bowl can be described as the pelvic cavity. The pelvic cavity contains your bladder, reproductive organs, the rectum section of the large intestine, etc. Okay, so back over here where we were looking at, jump back over here for a minute. We talked about the divisions of your dorsal major body cavity. Then we've talked about all the different divisions of the ventral body cavity. The ventral body cavity is lined with, and also the internal organs that are located within that cavity are lined or covered with special membranes that are called serous membranes, and that's what we're going to talk about on the next slide. Okay, so here's our term serous membranes, and it is serous, it's not serious. I didn't make a typo on this particular slide. Now, in a later lecture video clip for Unit 1, you're going to be learning about cell membranes, which are the protective coverings around the outside of each individual cell. So I don't want you to confuse a cell membrane with a serous membrane. A serous membrane is a very thin sheet of tissue, very, very thin, and what it does is it lines these compartments that we're learning about within the ventral body cavity. This is the only place where you have these located in the body. They also provide very thin coverings around the internal organs that are located within these cavities. And in addition to that, these serous membranes produce serous fluid. If you've ever done a dissection before on a non-preserved animal, maybe you got to do that at some point, and you've cut it open, you cut open the abdominal region, you might have noticed a gush of fluid coming out. That was the serous fluid that was located within the abdominopelvic cavity. Okay, look at this diagram up here. So I mentioned that the internal organs located within these cavities are covered with serous membranes, and then also these serous membranes line these cavities as well. Okay, so why do we have a picture here of a fist being punched into a balloon? Well, the fist here actually represents an organ that's located within one of these cavities. So if you can imagine, when you take your fist, and if you were able to shove that into a balloon, as you know, portions of the balloon would surround your fist, but then you would still have additional portions of the balloon out here at the balloon surface, and then in between you would have that airspace in between. Okay, and that's how these serous membranes are oriented around these body cavities and also around the organs that are contained within them. Think about those organs as kind of being like a fist that's being pushed through a balloon. And that means that those organs are going to have a layer of serous membrane that's directly in contact with them, but then you're going to have an outer layer of serous membrane as well that lines those cavities. And then in between, you're going to have space located there. Now, obviously, a balloon is filled with air, but the space inside these cavities is not filled with air. It's filled with serous fluid. Okay? And then on top of that, the membranes are going to, these serous membranes are going to be named differently depending on whether they are in contact with the organ or whether they're lining the cavity. Whether they're the inside layer of the serous membrane in contact with the organ or the outside layer of the serous membrane that's lining that particular compartment. Okay? So, if the serous membrane is in contact with the organ itself, it's referred to as a visceral serous membrane, and if it's lining the cavity, it's referred to as a parietal serous membrane. And then these different membranes are going to have different names depending on where they're located. Okay, so let's take a look at this example that we see here. We're looking at the pericardial cavity that's located within the mediastinum, which is located within the thoracic cavity. And so you see the heart sitting in there, and you've got a light blue line here surrounding the heart. That represents the portion of that serous membrane that's directly in contact with the heart. And then you've got another blue line out here representing the portion of that serous membrane that's lining the cavity itself. Okay? So the portion of that membrane directly in contact with the heart is called the visceral pericardium. The portion that lines the cavity is called the parietal pericardium. Okay, and then what's in that space here that I'm coloring in with the pen? You don't have air in there. That contains serous fluid, which in the case of the heart is called pericardial fluid. So if you've ever heard about somebody having excessive fluid around the heart, that's the fluid that they're talking about. They have excessive pericardial fluid surrounding the heart, and that can put excessive pressure on the heart and cause problems. Okay, now what about the serous membranes that are associated with the pleural cavities? Okay, it's the same concept. You have that inner layer directly in contact with the lungs, and that's going to be called the visceral pleura. And then you're going to have an outer layer that lines the cavity, and that's going to be called the parietal pleura. Now, around the lungs, you have what's called a potential space in between those two membranes. They're really more or less in contact with each other under normal circumstances, but you do have a potential, a little bit of space in between, and that will contain pleural fluid. Okay? And so people can wind up having excessive amounts of pleural fluid around their lungs as well, and that can cause problems with breathing. Incidentally, this term visceral, and if you think about viscera, that term always refers to organs. If you think about the word eviscerate, if someone or something, some animal is eviscerated, that generally means that all or most of its internal organs have been cut out of the body. Okay, so visceral refers to organs, and that's a good way to remember which of those two membranes is directly in contact with the organ. And then just remember that parietal refers to the portion of the membrane that's lining the cavity. I don't know how these things keep getting stuck in here. Anyway. Okay, now what about down in the abdominopelvic cavity? Okay, so what kind of section are we looking at over here? We're looking at a sagittal section or view of the abdominopelvic cavity. So up here's your diaphragm, and then below here we have all of that portion of the ventral major cavity that's referred to as the abdominopelvic cavity or the peritoneal cavity. Okay, and you're going to have fluid-filled spaces within this cavity as well, and that is referred to as peritoneal fluid. Okay, so on our diagram over here, I'm going to erase that for a second. I'm going to change colors. Notice here on this particular diagram, they've got some light-colored lines passing through here, kind of snaking through here. And that light-colored line represents these peritoneal serous membranes that are located in the abdominopelvic cavity. And again, this is a sagittal view. So you've got a two-dimensional, very thin slice that you're looking at on the side view of the body. Now you think about these organs that are snaking through here, especially the intestines, the small and the large intestines. They snake their way all the way through the abdominopelvic cavity. And so when you cut it from a side view in a two-dimensional slice like this, it's going to pass through those organs in different locations. And so where it's cut those snaking organs, you're just going to see little circles and ovals where that imaginary blade passed through there. So that's why you see those types of representations on the diagram. Okay, now in here, at any location where the serous membrane is directly in contact with an organ of the abdominopelvic cavity, it's referred to as the visceral peritoneum. And then any location where it's lining the cavity itself, further out here, that's referred to as parietal peritoneum. And it doesn't matter whether that membrane is in contact with the liver or the stomach or the large intestine or the small intestine. It's just referred to as visceral peritoneum if it's actually covering the organ itself. Then if it's lining the cavity, it's called the parietal peritoneum. And then the space in here, in between parietal peritoneum and visceral peritoneum, all through there, that is called, that's going to be filled with serous fluid, which in the case of this particular part of the body, is going to be called peritoneal fluid. Okay, so those are the major body cavities that are internal to the body. You do have other locations where you have smaller body cavities, as you would know, such as the oral cavity, which is the opening on the inside of your mouth, the nasal cavity, the opening up there in the nose. Then you also have sinuses, which are small cavities or compartments that are actually located within your cranial and facial bones of the skull. You're going to learn a whole lot more about those when you get to Unit 3 in this course. Then obviously you have the cavities where your eyeballs are located. Those are called the orbital cavities. Then you have the cavity, the opening for your ear. That's the middle ear cavity where your eardrum is located. Okay, so that's all we're going to talk about today, just giving you an overview of those major body cavities and the serous membranes that line the compartments within the ventral body cavity. And be sure to learn all the terminology. That takes a little bit of work, but you will need to know that terminology as you progress through your Biology 201 and 202 courses. And that's it for me. I will see you sometime during Unit 2. Bye-bye.